A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who are imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid. It might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid. It might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid. We may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid. Love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid. Our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Such a beautiful poem. Audre Lorde was very instrumental in framing a Black queer feminist identity at a time when that identity wasn't welcome or wasn't included in wider mainstream feminist groups and circles. Litany for Survival is her most famous poem. This poem is about oppression. It's about the marginalization of specific communities and of women, people who are, this is a more modern word, but intersectional. She wrote and understood intersectionality in a way that was far beyond her time. And most of that was because she grew up at a time when segregation still existed. So as an African-American girl under segregation, she's marginalized. But then also as a lesbian, she's marginalized by mainstream society and also within the African-American community. So she's writing about these systems and how the systems are created and function in a way that makes it difficult for people who don't meet that average or who don't fit into the standard. They aren't created in a way that helps those people survive. So let's go through and let's do a line-by-line analysis of the poem and unpack some of the ideas that are present within this poem and also the connections that can be made. Now, these are by far not the only connections that a person can make. You can make connections as you read literature to yourself, to your own personal experiences, your own personal stories, which are some of the most powerful and beautiful connections. But especially if you're a second language learner or you're someone who's not as familiar with literature, making connections to the world at large in the poem, so a connection between the poem and the world at large, is a powerful way of trying to get into the frame of mind of the poet as they were writing. So let's go back to the beginning of the poem.
What are your thoughts about the poem? I'd love to read your comments and respond to them, because that's the most important part.
Now I'm going to read through the lines of the poem and make connections between the poem and the world. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, Okay, so a shoreline is a barrier. It's the barrier between land, that is the world where we can live and thrive as humans, and the ocean, which is more of an inhospitable terrain. In many ways, that barrier between land and sea has been a barrier that humans haven't gone over because it takes considerable effort to sail on the ocean, build a boat, build a raft, do something like that. So she says, for those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, so that shoreline, that edge, is really an edge between a decision of the familiar perhaps, versus a decision of something that may be more complicated, that may be harder decision to make. Crucial and alone. Crucial means important. So crucial and alone, that's referring to those decisions at the shoreline, these decisions that a person absolutely has to make, but then they're alone, meaning the decision is something that must be difficult, must involve some possibly alienation. Who knows, but they're alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, you cannot indulge. That means you cannot give into, or you cannot give yourself the option of taking a passing dream of choice. So I read that as meaning there's some people who don't have a choice. They stand on the shoreline between decisions, one decision or another, and they don't have the option of acting as if they don't have a choice to make that decision, perhaps. Who love in doorways coming and going. Oh, okay. So when I read that, I think about how Audre Lorde was a lesbian. She was a lesbian at a time when people unfortunately had to hide their sexual orientation, right? So she's loving in doorways coming and going. So this idea of like not being able to love in the open, not being able to love in your own home, even perhaps, in the hours between dawns. Oh, okay. So loving in doorways, coming and going in the hours between dawns. I make the connection of, since she was a lesbian and it wasn't acceptable for her to be openly gay at the time, then she had to hide it and do it between doorways, which meant it wasn't until she got inside of her own doorway or the doorway of her partner or the doorway of people who are welcoming that she's able to show this, to show her love, right? From sunup until sundown, but not during the day when other people might see her. Looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. I need to unpack that. Looking inward and outward, at once before and after. So maybe that has something to do with this idea of having to hide that love and not being able to openly express her love, having to do it between doorways where it's hidden, looking inward and outward, having to put on a face to society, acting like she's straight because that's accepted and that puts her in less danger, looking inward and outward. So this, like W.B. Du Bois says, this double consciousness of being Black. But if you think of intersectionality, it could also be the double consciousness of being Black and of being, so that marginalization creates a double consciousness, but marginalization within a marginalized group, maybe that creates a triple consciousness, who knows? But that's the connection that I make when I read that, at once before and after. Seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. Oh gosh, that idea that their dreams will not reflect the death of ours, what I think of is, having to love between doorways, having to hide. So if she has children, or just the idea of the youth, whoever those youth are, the next generation, that next generation, their dreams not having to reflect the death of hers means what I interpret it as is they're able to fully realize themselves and their dreams so that they can lead lives that reflect their choice and what they want without her or people who are marginalized having to make these concessions to contort themselves, being forced into a decision. Because if she's forced to choose to hide something in order for her children to have choice, then her children's dreams reflect the death of her own dreams. And she's hoping that she doesn't have to make that choice. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. Ooh. So imprinted with fear, when I think of imprinting, I think of animals, like baby animals when they're born. Ducks, for example. Ducks imprint on the living thing that they see first. So she's referring to marginalized groups and how there's always that fear that you'll be attacked or targeted, and that imprintation begins at birth, right? It's like a faint line in the center of your forehead. And as you know, if there's a line on your forehead, that is the first thing that people see. So that fear is visible from the very beginning. Learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. So a baby, the first thing a baby eats is its mother's milk. That is the nourishment that a baby needs. And that fear is imprinted from the beginning. For by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found. Oh, the illusion of safety comes with the idea that a mother is the original source of safety for a baby, for humans. Like you often hear that when people in their last breaths or when they're absolutely afraid, they call out to their mothers because they remember that experience of childhood of their mothers being there, nurturing them. The safety that comes, that's associated with a mom. For this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. So the heavy-footed, those who are oppressors, are silencing us through this idea of safety, of making this imprintation on us from birth, this imprintation of fear. Because if you can make someone afraid as they're growing up, make that one of their first memories, then they're less likely to step out of line, right? For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. Oh, so when I think this instant, this triumph, I think about the fact that maybe she's writing during the civil rights movement at a time when things are just changing so much. She's referring to this triumph of things finally being different, finally changing. And then that line, we were never meant to survive, I think is a reference to that faint line, that fear. They were never meant to survive to the point where they can see that triumph, where they can overcome that fear. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. So you have right there that repetition of the line, when, and then some very common everyday situation, we're afraid. So that is the repetition that gives the idea that of that fear being ever constant, always being there. And a lack of punctuation signals all of these ideas mixed together. But notice how the lines are not all carried over. So the lines are grouped by twos, and every two lines is maybe a complete thought, you could say. When the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion, right? When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we're still afraid. So the beginning, the first few things that she lists here, they're things that, you would expect of people who are oppressed or in a situation that's difficult. When the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain, right? So having that fear response is a form of trauma, right? When the sun sets, we are afraid. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. So as the list goes on, it becomes more and more focusing not just on the everyday things, but focusing on the kind of psychological state of that oppression and how that psychological state really is just going to lead to fear no matter what. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So this idea of ending it with when we are silent, we are still afraid. So that's a pretty powerful line to end with, that idea that when we're silent, we're still afraid. So the fear is going to be constant, as she's mentioned in the previous stanza. And then the last 3 lines. So it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. That repetition leading up to that last line makes the last line that much more powerful. And you notice the lack of punctuation means that last line goes with, it's really a continuation of that previous stanza. So it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. So this idea, really she's speaking to the thought that being silent is in some way going to benefit a person who's part of a marginalized group, and to tell them, no, it's not going to benefit you to be silent. The truth is that everything is set up for you to remain silent, and fear is a tactic used to try to silence you. But if you remain silent, there's no guarantee, and not only is there no guarantee, but there's no way that you can ever really exercise your will and to achieve your goals if you remain silent. So it's better to speak up, knowing full well that you were never meant to survive. Embracing that idea that the system was never meant to benefit you, meant for you to thrive in, is really the best way for you to then understand just how powerful your voice can be. It's set up for you not to speak. So not speaking means you're never going to change anything, because you have to speak. Unless you speak, you'll never even have the opportunity to reach that point where you can be heard. Her poem is so beautiful, and you see the reflection of those thoughts, those sentiments in so many situations in the world where groups of people are conditioned to be in fear, even though there's nothing to fear at all. The system never meant you to survive, but you still have a voice, and you have the opportunities, and you have the blessings to be able to use that voice and to thrive.
And this is the most important part. What are your thoughts about the poem? I'd love to read about and respond to your comments. And consider liking the video if you found value in what you watched.